Hi everyone, welcome back to Philosophy of the Paranormal with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So I'm recording in a different location today because I'm on a bit of a working holiday, staying with some family for a little bit, just for a change of pace, for some visiting and so on and so forth. I did have a test for the COVID-19 virus before I traveled, which was an interesting experience. And we wanted to make sure that we were not ill before we left, my partner and I, so we both got tested. That was fun. We were both sitting there for 3 hours or so, but everything's good. We're both good to go. So, that's good. As for why I'm a bit late getting to this, well, as soon as I got here, I was approached to take over for another instructor who has had a death in the family. And I agreed to do that. And per my announcement on See You Learn, I have fallen a little bit behind because of the prep work that I've taken on for this additional course. But don't worry, because I will adjust the deadlines for your critical responses to accommodate for this. So by the time this lecture is live, which will probably be Tuesday the 14th, well, that will only leave you a couple of days until your critical response on these lectures on the uncanny would be due. So I will extend it, probably until Sunday at midnight, but I will let you know for certain. I'll probably make an announcement after I'm finished recording this video. So anyway, if I have to be a little bit flexible with the lecture schedule in future, then I will be equally flexible with the deadlines for your critical responses. And that way you don't have to worry about cramming in the same amount of work in less time. All right, well, that's about it for the housekeeping stuff that I wanted to talk about. I suppose we should begin, before we get to Freud's essays on the uncanny, we should do a little bit of a recap and remind ourselves what Jentsch thinks of the uncanny. So let's get started with that now. So before we really dive into the details here, let's have this quick recap. And I should emphasize, by the way, that this is another one of those lectures where I'm kind of like riffing a little bit. So the slides are a little sparse compared to what the kinds of slides that I would usually put together, just in terms of how much information is in them. So do take notes. Once again, this will be beneficial to you. But remember, we started off our discussion on the uncanny by noticing that in both the case of Freud and of Jentsch, they both seem to think that the uncanny, or the German word das Unheimlich, conjures up this kind of sense of the familiar or yet unfamiliar. For example, Jentsch wrote, "Without a doubt, this word appears to express that someone to whom something uncanny happens is not quite at home or at ease in the situation concerned, that the thing is, or at least seems to be, foreign to him. In brief, the word suggests a lack of orientation is bound up with the uncanniness of the thing or incident." So that's something Jentsch says early on in his paper, this kind of lack of orientation, which he ultimately takes to be a result of psychical, or what we would say in modern English, psychological uncertainty, or perhaps mental uncertainty. Freud says something similar. He says, "The uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar." And this one little sentence is going to be very important for understanding how Freud understands the uncanny. In any case, a couple of similarities, a couple of differences here, right? Interestingly, Freud and Jentsch were both trained as physicians. So Jentsch was a physician, general practice kind of guy, as far as I know. Freud was a neuroscientist. I don't know too much about Jentsch's movement into the psychological world, or into early psychology, but Freud became interested in and developed a field called Psychoanalysis, which was designed to get at the, again, so-called psychical roots of what we would today call mental illness. because Freud would often find that he could find nothing physiologically wrong with people who were perhaps experiencing anxiety, depression, or who were neurotic, so on and so forth. So Freud looked for mentalistic kinds of answers, or psychoanalytic, more accurately, kinds of answers. And we'll get into what that means in a moment. They both seem to focus on this familiar yet foreign kind of character of the uncanny, which is right there in the etymology of the word, especially if we literally translate the German word unheimlich, which translates to unhomely, then that is really made apparent. So, and this is something Freud notes in the beginning of his paper as well. The literal translation of unheimlich into English is unhomely, but its closest translatable term, at least etymologically, would be something like uncanny or eerie. So Freud and Jentsch agree at least on that point. Freud and Jentsch also seem to agree that this uncanny sensation we're talking about here, or the sense of eeriness, as I like to call it, is really an emotion. This is something that's emphasized a little bit in Jentsch's paper, but a lot more in Freud's paper, right? Freud, in the quote we just read, calls the uncanny a species of the frightening. And what is frightening, what we would today call fright anxiety, is like a rudimentary emotion that we find in every human culture. And the facial expressions and vocalizations and the physiological responses that come along with those kinds of emotions are the same all across the world. So for that reason, fright anxiety is a rudimentary emotion. And the uncanny is a kind of that. And I agree with Freud here, although I disagree with him about many other things, as we'll see. Anyway, Jentsch gets a little bit more specific than simply saying that the uncanny is something that is not quite at home or at ease in the situation concerned. He says that this affective component of the uncanny is a result of the earlier mentioned psychical or psychological uncertainty. Today we would just call it mental uncertainty or psychological uncertainty. So this uncertainty, according to Jentsch, while necessary, perhaps, to explain this uncanny sensation that accompanies uncanny things or situations, might not be sufficient to explain this feeling. What do I mean by that? Well, this is something that Freud, right off the bat, starts in his paper. He criticizes Jentsch for this. Criticizes him for taking him to mean, or criticizes Jentsch for saying or claiming that it's just psychological uncertainty that causes the uncanny sensations. That can't be true. And actually, I think this is a bit of an uncharitable reading of Jentsch by Freud. And in any case, it's also kind of a straw man against Jentsch, because Jentsch doesn't just say it's psychological uncertainty. It's psychological uncertainty about a particular thing, and that is animacy. Whether animate things are maybe actually inanimate, or inanimate things might actually be animate, right? If we have uncertainty about those things, then perhaps an uncanny sensation or this experience of eeriness can be elicited. So that's why Jentsch ties the experience of this affective uncanny, the affective uncanny, or the sense of eeriness, with effigies or wax figures, dolls, I would say certain kinds of photographs, those of human figures where the photographs, there's that optical illusion where photographs' eyes, the eyes of the person in the photo, appear to follow you as you move across the room, almost as if the person in the picture was alive. This is just an optical illusion, but it's kind of weird when you experience it. So I would add to that, of course, CGI characters, right? They often fall into the uncanny valley, as it's said by many video game designers and filmmakers and so on in this day and age. So it's not just uncertainty for Jentsch. And this is something perhaps I should have emphasized a little bit more in our last lecture, but it's not just psychological uncertainty. Psychological or psychical uncertainty may be a necessary sufficient, sorry, I'm a little tired. Psychological uncertainty may be a necessary condition to experience the sense of eeriness that's associated with the uncanny, but it is not sufficient. What you might need to make, what you might need so that you have all of the necessary and sufficient conditions are, uncertainty about the right kinds of properties, namely whether something is alive or whether it has a mind. I'm just thinking that I might upload a couple chapters from my master's thesis as optional reading to go along with this lecture. I clarify a lot of this stuff in these 2 chapters, and I won't make it required reading, but you'll be welcome to take a look at it if you want to. Anyway, it's also interesting because, as we saw last time, Jentsch doesn't just point to uncertainty about whether animate things might be inanimate or inanimate things animate. He also draws this connection between uncanniness, uncertainty, and animism, an animistic worldview, right? Primitive peoples, or primitive man, as Jentsch called them, what we would today call hunter-gatherer societies, tend to have more of an animistic worldview. They tend to view the world as populated by, agents with minds, gods and spirits and so forth, right? And children are kind of the same, right? Children also do this. Children have no problem pretending or imagining that a stuffed animal or a doll really is alive and has mental states and so on. Children are really good at this kind of imaginative play. So children, as well as early human societies, have this tendency toward animism. And indeed, children are quite comfortable with dolls whose eyes open and close, where maybe some adults might be a bit creeped out. Alternatively, some quote-unquote primitive peoples, if they're not exposed to, say, mechanical machinery, or not familiar with, modern machinery, they might take something like a locomotive or a car to be alive to one extent or another. At least that's a kind of way that we can read what Jentsch is saying here. So, just to sum this up, it's not just uncertainty about, it's not just uncertainty. It's uncertainty about whether we're dealing with something that's animate or inanimate, or something that may have a mind or not have a mind. And I would argue that the sense of eeriness is especially powerful when our perceptions here violate our expectations about this thing, right? So if I see a lifeless automaton and I have no expectations that it's going to behave as if it has a mind, and then suddenly it looks at me and gestures at me and speaks to me as if it does have a mind, that's going to be kind of weird, right? So in any case, that's the point I want to really reiterate here. It's uncertainty about animacy and mentation, not just uncertainty. And this is going to be important when we get into Freud. Speaking of Freud, let's turn to him now. All right, so Freud's essay is divided into 3 parts, and in the first part he largely deals with the meaning of words like the uncanny. What does this mean? And we won't spend a lot of time talking about this. He quotes at length from various dictionaries and inserts some of his own commentary. And kind of before he undertakes this, he also complains that Jentsch does not go beyond relating the uncanny to the novel and the unfamiliar. For him, the essential condition for the emergence of the sense of the uncanny is intellectual uncertainty. So he's noting in this opening chapter, essentially, that there's not much that's been written on the uncanny because, in aesthetics, we're not really interested in things that are horrifying or frightening or grotesque, right? Which is another interesting thing, now that I think of it. Freud is undertaking a very aesthetic kind of approach to understanding this, and that probably explains his influence. When you read about the uncanny, you often read about it in terms of art, literature, film, sometimes even queer theory and areas like that. But Jentsch is doing something very different. Jentsch is doing something a lot more psychological. So what Freud says here, I disagree with when it comes to the science of the matter. But what he says also works quite well if you want to, understand art. So don't throw the baby out with bathwater when it comes to Freud. Okay. Anyway, right. So he's complaining how aesthetics hasn't paid much attention to this stuff. The uncanny is an interesting example of this, so he's going to focus on that. And Jentsch's account is, of course, the only real substantive account of the uncanny that Freud is able to find. And even as I mentioned in the previous lecture, Jentsch's paper was not available in English for nearly a century. So people read Freud's paper and read other works that are responding to Freud. Obviously, Freud has a very massive influence in the humanities when it comes to this stuff. But a lot of those people don't get to encounter Jentsch and what Jentsch actually thought. And I, as I've mentioned, I actually think that Freud is a little unfair to Jentsch in this. But in any case, that's kind of how he starts things off, and then he talks at length about what the uncanny means before finally arriving at the definition I quoted earlier. So earlier I quoted Freud as writing, "The uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar." And that's kind of what Freud settles on at the end of chapter 1. The uncanny, das Unheimlich, the unhomely, is in some way a species of the familiar, das Heimlich, the homely. So let us relate this finding, which is still to be explained with so on and so forth. Freud is relating the unfamiliar to the familiar, but he also emphasizes throughout his look over all these different dictionary definitions of uncanniness and eeriness in all these different languages, but especially German, obviously. He also points out that there's something to the idea that what is uncanny was not only familiar, but was also hidden at some point. He also kind of emphasizes throughout this chapter that the uncanny is something that has been perhaps related to what is familiar, but also itself has been kept hidden. And that's going to come in handy when we read his actual psychoanalytical explanation of what uncanniness is. So we better get to that now, I suppose. So Freud is explaining uncanniness in terms of what we now call the return of the repressed. So a big part of psychoanalytic theory is this idea that things which we are familiar with, these are things that we might have fears about or anxieties about, are made unfamiliar because they are repressed, right? These frightening things are repressed by the mind. They're pushed away into the subconscious or the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, right? Now, okay, cool. But, Freud says, they can return from repression and appear symbolically in dreams or as anxieties or neuroses or different kinds of psychical illness, right? So maybe we can try and clarify this with the Sandman. This is why we read the Sandman. Jentsch mentions the Sandman and mentions Hoffman's knack for eliciting an uncanny sensation in his reader, or eliciting a sense of eeriness. And he mentions the Sandman particularly because there's an automaton, Olympia, in that story, right? That Nathaniel falls in love with until he sees her mechanical eyes, which had been made by Coppelius, the man who was there when his father died, and who he associates with the Sandman. He's driven to madness by this. And he's again driven to madness later upon Coppelius' return to his hometown, where he falls from this church bell tower and dies, right? So, horrible, creepy story. I hope you've all read it. But Jentsch mentions this skill of Hoffman's, and Freud talks about it too. And just to recap a little further, the Sandman is a Germanic folktale You've got your Sandman. He sprinkles dust in children's eyes so that they fall asleep. But in Hoffman's story, the Sandman is this sinister character who lives on the moon, and he takes children's eyes and brings them back to his children on the moon, who eat them with their hooked beaks. And this instills this fear of Coppelius in Nathaniel, because he associates Coppelius with the Sandman. Because of the experiences he recounts in his letters to Lothar. Anyway, Nathaniel, as we talked about last time, also falls in love with Olympia, who is an automaton. When he finds out the truth about her nature, and of course the way in which he finds out the truth nearly drives him nuts. Jentsch mentions, just one or two sentences in his paper. Jentsch mentions, Hoffman, like in The Sandman, is really good. I'm paraphrasing, but Jentsch says something like, Hoffman excels at eliciting this kind of thing. Just look at The Sandman. It's got an automaton, very frightening, so on and so forth, right? That's my bad paraphrasing of Jentsch. So Freud actually disagrees with Jentsch here. He doesn't think that Olympia is what makes the Sandman so creepy or such a frightening tale. He thinks it's the titular character, the Sandman, Coppelius. Coppelius, as we come to find out in Nathaniel's letters, finds out that Nathaniel is spying on Coppelius and Nathaniel's father, and he flies into a rage and grabs Nathaniel, and he's about to pour hot ashes into his eyes, and this, of course, reminds Nathaniel of this horrible tale of the Sandman. He's going to sprinkle dust in your eyes will pop out, and he'll gather them up and feed them to his children on the moon. Freud actually understands this fear of, Nathaniel's fear of losing his eyes as castration anxiety. So, okay, I think this is an interesting, if not odd, reading of Hoffman. But I'll just say right off the bat, before we explore this idea of castration anxiety, let's see whether, let's ask whether, I should say, the main character, not the titular character, Coppelius, the Sandman, really is uncanny, or whether Nathaniel's fears are uncanny. Well, the anxiety that Nathaniel lives with, maybe one could be argued, would be experienced by someone in his shoes from time to time as a sense of eeriness. But it seems to me that Coppelius is not eerie or creepy so much as he is simply horrifying or frightening. It doesn't seem to be the same kind of fright anxiety. I think uncanniness or eeriness is much more similar to anxiety, and horror is similar to outright fright or shock. So it just seems odd to me, because Coppelius is a little creepy, I suppose, but he's more terrifying than he is creepy, although he is creepy. But anyway, what is this castration anxiety? Well, a fear of losing the male member and the male sexual organs, right? This goes back to ancient myth, as do a lot of Freud's ideas. Zeus castrated his father Cronus, according to mythology. The Titanomachy, we call it. This is when the Titans battled the Olympians, right? Zeus's father, Cronus, feared being usurped, feared his power being taken away, right? And here, of course, the genitals are symbolic of power, right? And Zeus, for that reason, was hidden away from his father, because his father wanted to kill all of his children. And of course, Zeus and the other Olympians eventually defeated the Titans. Cronus, Zeus's father, is castrated, and his junk are thrown into the sea. And now Zeus reigns from Olympus. Zeus and the Olympians are now in charge of the Greek pantheon, right? It's a kind of loose summary of a very small part of ancient Greek myth. So castration anxiety is a fear of, a fear of losing power, a fear of losing one's male member. That's castration anxiety. And Freud sees Coppelius as relevant here because the eyes, he says, represent the male member. Now, okay. I really don't want to be uncharitable here. But Freud does spend a lot of time discussing, kind of justifying why the eyes work as this symbolic stand-in for the male sex organs or the male reproductive organs. I think it's a bit of a stretch. One of the things he argues is that, well, we all have such a fear of anything damaging the eye. But of course, this can be explained evolutionarily. The eyes are one of our most important sense organs. So if anything comes close to them, you reflexively try to protect your eyes by closing them or by, swiping away whatever's about to touch them. Of course, it's interesting that Coppelius is making the eyes and threatens to take or put out Nathaniel's eyes. So he's making the eyes for these automatons like Olympia. That's what these secret alchemical experiments are about with Nathaniel's father. So he's making eyes and threatening to take eyes from Nathaniel. But the really creepy part, at least the part that I feel weird and kind of creeps me out, was seeing a lifeless Olympia, or imagining a lifeless Olympia, the automaton, being carried away down the stairs by Coppelius with no eyes. Just a lifeless body with black holes in the eye sockets. So it's Olympia who loses the eyes. It's Olympia who's really, if we're going to read this in a Freudian way, it's really she who is castrated in the story and not Nathaniel. And I don't even think that that's meant to be eerie. That's meant to be shocking. The uncanniness of Olympia that I think Jentsch is referring to and that Freud kind of misses is Nathan's uncertainty or lack of knowledge about her true nature. When he's at this party that this Italian professor is putting on, everyone seems to be looking down on Nathan because he's so in love with Olympia. He doesn't know she's an automaton, where the others seem to suspect something is off with her. So for that reason, I think that Freud's reading of Jentsch, particularly when it comes to the Sandman, is a bit weird. And I don't think we really need psychoanalytic explanations to explain the uncanny. But in any case, this can help us make sense of what Freud means when he says that the uncanny is a species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. It's because for him, it's all really to do with anxiety because of repressed fears returning. But that's not all. This is the part where Freud really departs from Jentsch. This kind of psychoanalytic reading of Hoffman's story. I don't quite agree with Freud here. I do agree with him more in what follows, but the interesting thing is, Freud also seems to agree with Jentsch to a very great extent in what follows. So let's talk about some of the other examples of the uncanniness that Freud discusses, and we'll see if we can make some sense out of those. Whether we need to rely on psychoanalysis or whether Jentsch's idea of psychical uncertainty suffices. Right, so some of the other examples of uncanniness or uncanny kinds of situations that Freud discusses are, things like deja vu, this feeling of deja vu, or this encounter with one's doppelganger, and strange coincidences that seem to result from something that Freud calls the omnipotence of thoughts, following a suggestion from one of his patients. So I'll explain each of these in their turn. So, an encounter with one's doppelganger. Doppelganger is German for double goer, and it's the idea that there may be a physical double of you somewhere. This is also kind of a spooky, weird, creepy paranormal idea that you used to find in a lot of books on unexplained phenomena. The really interesting thing about the doppelganger is that you know, assuming doppelgangers exist, which, you know, I don't believe they do, but you know, the idea of the doppelganger is not only that it is like physically just like you, but that perhaps some of your thoughts can enter into your doppelganger's mind, or some of your doppelganger's thoughts can enter into your mind. So this kind of idea of this telepathic link between you and your doppelganger. That's what really makes the idea creepy. Another interesting thing Freud discusses here is deja vu, right? The sense that you've been there or seen the same thing or been to the same location or something. You know, glitches in the matrix, as it were, right? And strange coincidences, too. We'll go into each of these in a little bit more depth here. For deja vu, I mean, Freud relates a really interesting account where he was in Italy and kept getting lost, only to keep coming back to the town square, or wherever it was that he started trying to find his way away from, right? So this idea of leaving the town square, getting lost, and, you know, swearing that every time you're going a different way but always ending up back in the same place is also kind of weird and creepy. And strange coincidences are really interesting too. He relates you know, stories of people saying, you know, oh, so-and-so, that fiend, he ought to be struck dead, only for that person to learn that the person dies of a stroke, like the next day or something. So strange coincidences like that, which Freud calls results of what is ostensibly the omnipotence of thoughts, this seeming way in which a thought can impact the world. Now, Freud's not saying this is actually what's going on. By cursing someone dead, you don't make them actually die. You know, you don't put something out into the universe and then it happens. That's not what he's saying. But when coincidences like this occur closely enough, you know, say cursing someone dead and then they do die, when it's coincidentally, you know, those two things co-occur coincidentally, it can seem as though that's what's going on, that there is some kind of omnipotence of thoughts, or thoughts have this power to impact the world. So that's very interesting. That's something that Freud discusses as an example of something that is very uncanny. How does Freud explain cases like this, along with other cases, like, for example, talks about the evil eye, this idea of the evil eye a little bit as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it is worth a mention. Well, how does Freud explain all this stuff? Well, he appeals to an animistic worldview. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it's exactly the same thing that Jentsch ends up talking about in his paper. I'm quoting from Freud here. He writes, "The analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe, a view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, by the narcissistic overrating of one's own mental processes, by the omnipotence of thoughts and the technique of magic that relied on it, by the attribution of carefully graded magical powers to alien persons and things, and by all the inventions with which the unbounded narcissism of that period of development sought to defend itself against the unmistakable sanctions of reality." So this is a long, wow, that's one whole sentence. Don't you love how people used to write really long sentences? Anyway, what Freud is saying here is that we used to look at the world this way. We used to understand it as being controlled by these spirits or gods or animate mental forces, agents with minds in the world that could control things and that we might be able to control by doing the right sorts of things, perhaps thinking the right way or doing the right kinds of rituals or something like that. Now, I find that very interesting that Freud ends up returning to this idea of animacy and animism. Um, but before I talk about that, let's return to some of the things that Freud criticizes Jentsch for. Freud opens up his paper by writing, on the whole, Jentsch does not go beyond relating the uncanny to the novel and the unfamiliar. For him, the essential condition for the emergence of a sense of the uncanny is intellectual uncertainty. One would suppose, then, that the uncanny would always be an area in which a person was unsure of his way around. The better oriented he was in the world around him, the less likely he would be to find the objects and occurrences in it uncanny. Okay, fair enough. But again, I've already mentioned that I don't think Jentsch meant to say that intellectual or psychical uncertainty was a sufficient condition for experiencing an uncanny sensation or a sense of eeriness, right? I think that's an uncharitable reading of Jentsch, because Jentsch gives, really two very big examples of what can contribute to the affective side of the uncanny, the feeling of uncanniness. And that is, as we've seen, uncertainty about whether something is animate or inanimate. And I would argue, when Jentsch is animate in the same way as we are, that is not just alive, but perhaps has a mind. Or conversely, that something that maybe is alive and has a mind, or that we expect to be alive and have a mind, does not have one and is not alive. This could explain the uncanniness of corpses. So I think this is rather uncharitable, right? I also don't think that we need to resort to a psychoanalytic approach to explain the uncanny. Psychoanalysis is really interesting. It is not scientific. It's no longer regarded as scientific. There's nothing that we can empirically evaluate about psychoanalysis, which is why Freud has fallen out of favor in psychology, but why he has still read in those areas I mentioned earlier, like the humanities. Spend a lot of time reading Freud. And a lot of Freud's work on this kind of thing can explain why good art works the way it does, but it doesn't necessarily explain why real people experience a sense of eeriness or uncanniness in real life situations. At least it doesn't explain it in a way that we can empirically test, where I think Jentsch actually does do that, which is really impressive. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this more, but maybe we'll come back to it in our lecture on ghosts, or if we end up doing a lecture on zombies, I expect we'll come back to many of these themes as well. And we can talk about Jentsch a little more then. Anyway, where was I? Freud is kind of saying, Jentsch says only intellectual uncertainty is required, and we've seen that's not the case. I mean, Jentsch acknowledges that there are individual differences in sensitivity to the uncanny, and he points out two very important ways in which we can come to experience the uncanny, right? Uncertainty about animacy and mentation, or inanimacy and the lack of a mind. And also an animistic worldview might lead us to experience the uncanny quite a bit, if indeed we looked at the world as populated by spirits that are, spirits or gods that are animate and which think in human-like ways. And of course, if you have this sense that there is such an entity out there, yet you cannot see it in a kind of way I discussed in the last lecture, I think that would be pretty creepy. Moving on. So Freud does dismiss Jentsch's condition of intellectual uncertainty as being insufficient for the uncanny. That's fine. I think it's uncharitable, but it doesn't really pose a problem for Jentsch, because Jentsch and Freud himself pays very close attention to automata and to animism. I guess the abridged version of Freud's paper that I've always had in mind is that, Jentsch is wrong, but automata and animism and those kinds of things, yeah, they're very creepy, and here's why. Animistic worldview. Mm-hmm. So Freud kind of kicks animism and perceptual perceptual animacy and all of that stuff, kicks it out the front door, and then lets it back in the back door in a sneaky kind of way, right? And I've even indicated in my slides here, I think Freud's discussion of animism is actually uncannily similar to Jentsch's discussion. I don't intend for there to be a pun there. It's just that I get it's just so interesting to me that Freud says, oh, Jentsch's explanation is not complete, yet Freud kind of ends up where Jentsch does by the end of his paper as well. Here's a couple of quotes just so that you can compare the two. The first is from Jentsch, who in his paper wrote, "An important factor in the uncanny is the natural tendency of man to infer, in a kind of naive analogy with his own animate state, that things in the external world are also animate, or, perhaps more correctly, are animate in the same way. It is all the more impossible to resist the psychical urge, the more primitive the individual's level of intellectual development is." Okay. Further says, "It is not astonishing if that which man himself semi-consciously projected into things from his own being now begins to terrify him in those very things, or that he is not always capable of exercising the spirits which were created out of his own head from that very head. This inability thus easily produces the feeling of being threatened by something unknown and incomprehensible that is just as enigmatic to the individual as his own psyche usually is as well." Now, those two passages are uncannily similar to this quote from Freud that I read earlier. "The analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe, a view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, etc." There's an uncanny similarity there. So, yeah, I guess, long story short, Freud is owed his due in the humanities when it comes to explaining great works of art or literature, great plays, understanding mythology, and how the uncanny figures into those things. Some of what Freud says may be useful, but I don't think what Freud says is very useful for scientifically understanding the uncanny, and that's unfortunate for us, because I think if we understand the uncanny naturalistically, if we can naturalize the uncanny, as it were, well, then we might have some more tools in our toolbox to understand the paranormal, or at least why people believe in paranormal things. And this is, of course, something that I'll talk about quite a bit in our lecture on ghosts, in addition to some other interesting stuff. But anyway, Freud is certainly owed his due. Freud also actually attempts to give a definition of the uncanny itself. That is something that Jentsch doesn't do. Jentsch talks a lot about the feelings associated with the uncanny, but he doesn't really try to determine what the essence of it is, or he doesn't really get into the semantics, what it means, right? Beyond saying that it's a word that means unhomely, right? He doesn't really go beyond that. I think Freud makes an effort to do that, and I think Freud should be applauded for doing so. But I think for our purposes, and for my own research purposes in the past, Jentsch's work is actually a lot more useful, and unfortunately it's been read much less widely than Freud's work has. So, I think, and this, again, I'll make this chapter or two from my master's thesis optional reading if you want to take a look. It'll clarify a lot of this, but I think that what's going on here is when we encounter something that is uncanny, we experience this sense of eeriness. Now, what is the uncanny? For me, it's a very Jentschean kind of thing. The uncanny is something that's kind of familiar and foreign at the same time, or homely yet unhomely. And it has to do with what we believe, the sensation of the uncanny, or the sense of eeriness, has a lot to do with what we believe about things versus what we perceive about them. So I'll give you some examples here. So if we characterize eeriness as the emotion that accompanies an encounter with the uncanny. So eeriness is the emotional component, we'll say. Uncanniness might describe That's an uncanny object, or that automaton is very uncanny, or that robot falls into the uncanny valley, right? We can describe things as uncanny, and the feeling that it elicits in us is eeriness. That's how I understand it anyway. I propose that eeriness is actually a kind of anxiety. So it's not fright, like Freud seems to think. It is anxiety. Anxiety, by the way, is an emotion that depends quite a great deal on uncertainty. And we don't have time to get into this in too much depth, but basically I think eeriness is a type of anxiety that is elicited in the kinds of cases that Jentsch discusses, when we're unsure about the ontological nature of some entity that we're confronted with. It might seem to us, take a corpse. We've got these latent perceptions of life and of mentation, but here's this lifeless, thoughtless corpse before us. So our perceptions kind of jive with or clash with our expectations or beliefs about this entity that's before us. Perhaps it was a relative that we knew recently, and now all of a sudden we see them not alive. That can be very uncanny. Or take a robot, all right? Robots are inanimate objects, but they act as if they're animate. They move around. They move with purpose and with intention. They move their eyes around and make eye contact with you sometimes, which can be kind of weird. So here's this inanimate object that doesn't have a mind, acting as if it's animate and has mental states and stuff like that. So what we perceive about uncanny objects clashes with what we believe or expect, with our beliefs or expectations about those objects. And that elicits this sense of eeriness. And I think this might explain some components of purported paranormal phenomenon as well. Phenomena, I should say. I mentioned this a little bit in my last lecture, but if, for example, you're staying in some kind of creepy house, some creepy old, damp, drafty Victorian house, like Norman Bates's house from Psycho, right? And you hear noises, you hear rapping, you hear voices, you hear creaking. It's probably explainable naturalistically, right? It's an old house, it's got leaks, drafts, it's creepy, it's already kind of dark, so we're already maybe primed to be afraid and be on the lookout for other agents in the world that might wish to do us harm. And we may misperceive that they are out there, even if we can't see them or encounter them directly. And this uncertainty about whether there's some kind of ghost or spirit in our presence probably feels pretty creepy and probably explains, probably can help to explain a good portion of these purported paranormal phenomena. I'll just leave you with the same conclusion that Jentsch reached. He writes at the very end of his paper, "The human desire for intellectual mastery of one's environment is a strong one. Intellectual certainty provides psychical shelter in the struggle for existence. However it came to be, it signifies a defensive position against the assault of hostile forces, and the lack of such certainty is equivalent to the lack of cover in the episodes of that never-ending war of the human and organic world, for the sake of which the strongest and most impregnable bastions of science were erected." So what is Jentsch saying there? Well, if we intellectually master our environment and we're less uncertain about it, well, it provides a kind of psychical shelter for us, right? It doesn't feel good to be at odds with the natural world, right? Or to think that there are things in that world that are out to get you needlessly. Certainly there are things that are out to get you, perhaps germs or predators, but there are other things that might not exist that you think are out to get you. And ultimately, this is why science was developed, is what Jentsch is saying here. And I think this fits thematically, at least, very well with the topic of this class. So that's all I have to say about Freud and Jentsch for now. I realize this has been kind of a stream of consciousness, kind of all over the place, kind of riffing on things sort of lecture. I apologize if that made things difficult for you, but I remind you that I am here to answer questions, and I will be uploading, something of a supplementary reading. It won't be necessary for you to read but I highly recommend you take a look at it. It will help clarify a lot of the things I've explained here if you are not certain about them. In your slides, it says that critical response will be due on July 17th, but I'm probably going to push that back. So the topic for the next critical response is the uncanny. So you can pick any idea from the readings for these two lectures, or something that I've brought up in these two lectures, any idea or question you have that's related to the two lectures on the uncanny, and you can discuss that. You can criticize it, you can say why you think it's a good idea, why you support it. Just talk about it. If there's an interesting idea, tell me why you agree with it. Tell me why you don't. Tell me if you think it could explain some paranormal phenomena, or if it couldn't explain some paranormal phenomena. If you think that Freud and Jentsch are absolutely irrelevant to understanding the paranormal, tell me that too. It's fine, all good. I just want you to critically engage with the material. Now, it should be 750 words in length. It should be double-spaced. You don't need a title page, but you do need to put all of your information, like your name, student number, course code, due date, that kind of thing. Of course, properly cite anything that you refer to. If you quote Jentsch, Freud, or Hoffman, you need to cite it properly. I'm not picky about citation styles, but just make sure that it is cited. We don't want to commit plagiarism. All right. So the next lecture, as I mentioned, is all about ghosts. I'll probably be taking a look at a chapter from a book about consciousness that I used in a previous class by Susan Blackmore, a former parapsychologist. And we'll be talking about old, examples of things like mediumship and seances, as well as stuff like Ouija boards and some of the scientific work that was done in the late 20th century to explain these weird phenomena in a naturalistic way. All right, so that's it for now. Do let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon with the next lecture all about ghosts. Bye for now, everybody.